In the spring of AD 70, the Roman Empire stood at the height of its power. Its roads stretched across mountains and deserts, its fleets crossed the Mediterranean, and its legions guarded frontiers thousands of miles from Rome. Yet in the eastern province of Judea, a war was reaching its most terrible moment. At the center of that war stood Jerusalem, a city whose importance was religious, political, and emotional far beyond its size. Jerusalem was preparing for Passover when the Roman army appeared. Pilgrims had traveled from distant regions to celebrate the festival. The streets were crowded, the markets were busy, and the temple dominated the city. But Jerusalem was also divided. Years of rebellion had produced rival factions, competing commanders, and bitter internal violence. While the Romans approached from outside, enemies were fighting one another inside the walls. The Roman commander was Titus, son of the Emperor Vespasian. He had already spent years campaigning in Judea. He understood the terrain, the politics, and the methods of Roman siege warfare. Now he commanded four legions supported by auxiliary troops and allied forces. His objective was clear: capture Jerusalem and end the revolt. The defenders knew what the Roman army meant. Rome did not need to take the city in a single assault. The Romans could surround it, cut its supplies, construct siege works, and wait. They had engineers, artillery, disciplined infantry, cavalry, and an enormous logistical system. Jerusalem had walls and determined defenders, but its population had been swollen by pilgrims who had entered the city for the festival. More people meant more mouths to feed. The first clashes were violent. Roman soldiers established camps around the city while Jewish fighters launched sudden attacks. The defenders knew the streets and approaches. They could emerge from the gates, strike Roman positions, and retreat behind the walls. The Romans answered with methodical discipline. They built towers, prepared artillery, constructed ramps, and advanced their lines. The siege was becoming a contest between the courage of the defenders and the engineering of Rome. Roman soldiers were trained to build as well as fight. They could dig trenches, raise earthworks, construct roads, and move heavy equipment. Around Jerusalem, their camps became permanent military settlements. Wood was cut from the countryside. Stones and earth were moved. Siege engines were assembled. The landscape itself was being transformed into a weapon against the city. Inside Jerusalem, the political divisions became increasingly dangerous. Several factions controlled different areas. Their leaders distrusted one another and sometimes fought openly. Food stores were damaged or seized. Citizens could be punished for supporting rival groups. The defenders faced the Romans outside the walls and political enemies within them. Unity was desperately needed, but the rebellion had produced the opposite. Titus continued the advance. The Romans attacked the outer defenses and eventually captured the first wall. The defenders withdrew behind the next line. The fighting became close and brutal. Streets and buildings turned into strongpoints. Every doorway could hide a fighter. Every narrow passage could become an ambush. Roman soldiers had to clear the city step by step. The second wall eventually fell as well. The defenders retreated deeper into Jerusalem. Titus now faced the central problem of the siege. The city could not be captured quickly without enormous Roman losses, but allowing it to remain supplied would prolong the war indefinitely. The Romans therefore tightened the blockade. Famine began to change the city. At first, wealthy families could still obtain food. Then prices rose. Grain became scarce. Animals disappeared from streets and courtyards. People searched abandoned houses and storerooms. The poorest suffered first, but eventually hunger reached almost everyone. Strength disappeared from bodies that had once carried weapons and worked in markets. Starvation was a weapon that required no sword. It attacked the entire population at once. A hungry soldier could not fight effectively. A hungry child could not survive easily. A hungry city could not repair walls forever. The Romans understood that time favored them. Every day the blockade remained in place weakened the defenders. People attempted to escape. Some slipped through the walls at night. Others tried to cross Roman lines during confusion. Many were captured. The Romans now controlled the countryside and had built a system designed to prevent movement. Titus ordered a massive circumvallation, a continuous line of fortifications around Jerusalem. The work was completed with remarkable speed. The city was sealed. After the circumvallation, the situation became desperate. No meaningful supply could enter. Those inside could not leave safely. The city became a closed world. People fought over food. Families hid whatever they possessed. Rebel leaders attempted to maintain control through violence. The social order began to collapse under hunger and fear. Josephus, a Jewish commander who had surrendered to the Romans earlier in the war and later became associated with the Flavian court, described the suffering in his history of the conflict. His account must be read carefully because he had his own political reasons for explaining the disaster, but his writing preserves a vivid picture of a city approaching collapse. He described people becoming so desperate that things normally rejected as food became valuable. The famine was not simply a shortage. It was a destruction of normal human behavior. The rules that governed ordinary life became harder to maintain when survival was at stake. Meanwhile, Roman soldiers continued their work. Their camps remained organized. Supplies arrived from the surrounding provinces. Officers maintained discipline. Engineers repaired damaged equipment. The army could absorb losses and continue. Jerusalem could not replace its population or resources. The defenders nevertheless refused to surrender. Their motivation was powerful. Jerusalem was not merely a political capital. It contained the temple, the center of Jewish sacrificial worship. For many defenders, losing Jerusalem meant losing the heart of their religious world. Roman rule was already deeply resented, but the possibility of the temple being destroyed made surrender seem even more unbearable. Titus reportedly attempted to persuade the defenders to give up. He could offer survival to some and an end to the suffering. But negotiations failed. The factions inside the city remained determined to continue. For the Romans, the rebellion had to be crushed. For the defenders, surrender could mean dishonor, enslavement, or the destruction of everything they believed they were protecting. The Roman assault moved toward the temple complex. The temple stood on an enormous platform and was surrounded by walls, courts, gates, and buildings. It was one of the great architectural achievements of the ancient world. Its destruction would therefore be both a military victory and a cultural catastrophe. The fighting around the temple became especially intense. Roman soldiers approached under fire. Defenders launched attacks from elevated positions. Siege engines struck walls. Arrows and stones crossed the battlefield. Smoke and dust filled the air. Every Roman advance was contested. Every retreat brought the defenders closer to the place they most wanted to protect. The summer heat made conditions worse. Bodies could not easily be buried. Disease and exhaustion spread. Water and food were precious. Yet the fighting continued. The Roman army had reached the point where withdrawal would be politically humiliating, while the defenders had reached the point where surrender seemed impossible. The Romans built additional siege works and ramps. Trees were cut from the surrounding region. Huge quantities of earth and stone were moved. The soldiers worked under attack, often at great personal risk. The siege was becoming an enormous engineering project. Eventually, the Romans broke through toward the temple. Fighting spread across the complex. Ancient sources disagree about the exact sequence of events that led to the fire, but the result is clear. The temple was burned during the final battle. Titus may have ordered his soldiers to preserve it, but in the confusion of combat, Roman troops eventually set it ablaze. Flames rose over Jerusalem. Smoke covered the sky. The great sanctuary burned. Gold and wood were consumed. Stones cracked under the heat. People who had survived months of siege watched the center of their religious world disappear. The destruction was not simply the loss of a building. It marked the end of an entire historical era. The Roman army eventually took control of the temple complex. Resistance continued in other parts of the city, but the outcome was now certain. Jerusalem had fallen. The remaining defenders were killed, captured, or scattered. Many survivors were enslaved. Others were executed. The city was devastated. The exact number of victims is impossible to know with certainty. Ancient writers give enormous figures, some of which modern historians regard as exaggerated. But there is no doubt that the death toll was catastrophic and that enormous numbers of people were displaced. A major city had been destroyed after a siege of extraordinary brutality. For the Romans, the victory was celebrated as a triumph. Titus returned to Rome as a victorious commander. Captives and treasures were displayed. The spoils of Jerusalem were carried through the capital. The menorah and other sacred objects became symbols of Roman conquest. The Arch of Titus, built later, preserved scenes of the triumph in stone. The political importance of the victory was enormous. Vespasian had become emperor only after the civil wars of AD 69. His dynasty needed legitimacy. The conquest of Jerusalem gave the Flavian family a powerful military achievement. Titus became famous as the commander who had captured the rebellious city. Roman coins and monuments announced the victory throughout the empire. But the meaning of AD 70 was completely different for the Jewish people. The temple had been the center of sacrificial worship for generations. Its destruction forced Jewish religious life to transform. Priests could no longer perform the same sacrifices. Jerusalem was devastated. Communities across the Roman world had to adapt to a new reality. Yet the destruction did not destroy Judaism. Religious traditions survived. Scholars and teachers became increasingly important. Prayer, study, and communal life took on new significance. Jewish communities continued to exist throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. The loss of the temple became a central memory rather than the end of the tradition. This is one of the great paradoxes of the siege. Rome won militarily, but it could not erase the identity of the people it had defeated. It could destroy walls and buildings. It could carry away treasures. It could impose political control. It could not completely control memory. The Roman victory also demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of imperial warfare. Rome did not depend on one brilliant battle. It used organization, logistics, engineering, discipline, and time. The legions could build their own fortifications and siege machines. They could maintain supply lines. They could surround a city and continue the campaign for months. Jerusalem's defenders showed extraordinary determination, but determination could not create food. Strong walls could delay an army, but they could not permanently stop starvation. Internal division made the problem even worse. The city was being defeated both from outside and from within. The siege also demonstrates how political conflict can become impossible to reverse. Years before AD 70, different compromises might have been possible. As tensions increased, each side became more suspicious. Rebellion made Rome more determined to demonstrate authority. Roman repression made resistance more determined. Each action created the conditions for the next. By the time Titus arrived, the choices were already narrow. The Roman government could not easily accept a rebellion that had killed Roman soldiers and challenged imperial authority. The rebels could not easily surrender after years of fighting. Jerusalem became the point where the entire conflict had to be decided. The city itself was a complicated place. Wealthy families lived in impressive houses. Merchants operated shops. Craftsmen worked in crowded streets. Pilgrims traveled from distant lands. Priests served in the temple. Children grew up among markets and courtyards. Ordinary people had lives that had little to do with the ambitions of commanders. The tragedy is that those ordinary people were trapped inside a conflict they could not control. A farmer did not decide whether Rome should rule Judea. A child did not choose rebellion. A shopkeeper did not choose the siege. Yet when the walls closed and food disappeared, everyone suffered. The Roman soldier also had a human story. Many legionaries had traveled far from home. They slept in camps, followed orders, carried heavy equipment, and faced attacks from the walls. Some had joined the army years earlier and had never expected to become part of a battle remembered for 2,000 years. They were following a system larger than themselves. This contrast is important. History often remembers commanders and emperors, but wars are carried out by ordinary people. Titus made strategic decisions. Vespasian represented imperial authority. Rebel leaders made political choices. But thousands of soldiers and civilians experienced the consequences directly. When the temple burned, the symbolism was overwhelming. The Roman army had entered the sacred center of the city. The rebellion was finished. The empire had demonstrated its power. But the scene also contained an enormous human loss. A religious tradition had lost its central sanctuary, and a population had lost its city. After the destruction, the Roman army remained in control. The city was reorganized under imperial authority. The war did not end everywhere immediately. Rebel strongholds remained, most famously Masada, where resistance continued until the early 70s. But the central rebellion had been defeated. Masada would later become another famous Roman siege. Roman forces surrounded the fortress and constructed a huge ramp toward its walls. Eventually, the defenders were overwhelmed. With the fall of Masada, organized resistance in Judea was effectively extinguished. The consequences of the war continued for generations. Roman rule remained in the region, but the relationship between the population and the empire had been permanently changed. The memory of destruction remained powerful. Jerusalem became a symbol of both loss and endurance. For Rome, the war demonstrated that rebellion would be punished. The empire was enormous, and governors understood that central authority could not appear weak. The Flavian victory, therefore, served a political purpose far beyond Judea. It told other provinces that the emperor could mobilize the full power of Rome against a rebellious city. The triumph in Rome turned a distant catastrophe into public entertainment and political propaganda. Crowds watched prisoners and treasures move through the streets. The empire celebrated. Yet the people whose sacred objects were being displayed had experienced the same event as disaster. The difference between victory and tragedy depended on where a person stood. The Arch of Titus remains a remarkable reminder of this contrast. Its reliefs show Roman soldiers carrying the spoils of Jerusalem. The monument was created to glorify the Flavian victory, but modern viewers can also see it as a record of cultural loss. A monument built by conquerors became evidence for later generations of what had been taken. The fall of Jerusalem, therefore, has several layers. It was a military campaign, a political crisis, a religious catastrophe, an example of Roman siege engineering, and a human tragedy. No single explanation is enough. The event changed Rome, Judea, and the wider Mediterranean world. The destruction of the temple also had consequences for the development of Christianity. The early Christian movement had emerged within the Jewish world, and the destruction of Jerusalem became part of the historical environment in which Christianity developed. Different Christian writers interpreted the event in different ways, and later traditions attached theological meaning to it. The political and religious consequences therefore reached far beyond the immediate war. Jerusalem itself remained important. Roman rulers rebuilt and renamed parts of the city at different times. New populations arrived. New religious traditions developed. The city passed through many political transformations. But the memory of the temple remained central to Jewish identity. The siege also reveals something about ancient urban warfare. A fortified city could be incredibly difficult to capture directly. The Romans therefore combined pressure from multiple directions. They attacked walls while also cutting supplies. They used artillery while building new fortifications. They fought battles while manipulating the psychology of the defenders. The goal was not simply to kill soldiers. It was to make continued resistance impossible. Modern warfare has changed enormously, but the fundamental principle remains familiar. An army can defeat a city by destroying its military defenses, or it can defeat the city by making normal life impossible. The Romans used both methods. Their victory was not the result of one heroic charge. It was the result of sustained pressure. The defenders also understood the importance of morale. They believed the city could still be saved. Some believed divine intervention would come. Others fought because they preferred death to surrender. Their determination prolonged the siege, but it also increased the eventual destruction. The longer the resistance continued, the worse the famine became, and the more determined the Romans became to finish the campaign. This creates one of the darkest patterns in history. When both sides believe compromise is impossible, suffering can continue long after the military outcome is clear. The defenders may believe that surrender is worse than death. The attackers may believe that mercy will encourage future rebellion. Each side therefore continues, even when the cost becomes enormous. Jerusalem became trapped in that pattern. By the final weeks, the city had lost much of its ability to function normally. Markets could not operate as before. Food could not be replenished. Families were separated. The streets were filled with fear. The temple became a final refuge and final battlefield. Imagine the city during those last days. Smoke rises above the walls. Roman camps surround the horizon. Soldiers stand at gates. Civilians move through streets looking for food. The sounds of fighting come from the defensive lines. Somewhere inside, a family is trying to keep a child alive. Somewhere else, a soldier is sharpening a weapon. In the temple, priests continue their duties while the battle approaches. Outside the walls, Roman soldiers prepare their equipment. Their officers inspect positions. Engineers repair siege machines. Messengers carry orders. The army is tired, but it is organized. The Romans know the city is close to falling. They also know that the final assault could be extremely dangerous. When the fire begins, no one can control what follows. Flames move through structures. Smoke obscures the battlefield. Soldiers push forward. Defenders fight among burning buildings. Sacred objects are carried away or destroyed. The old city is transformed in hours. When the fighting ends, there is no simple victory scene. There is a ruined city. There are prisoners, dead, wounded, and displaced families. There are Roman soldiers who have survived and commanders who can finally report success. There are also survivors who must begin life after catastrophe. The Roman government could rebuild its political authority. It could create monuments. It could mint coins. It could celebrate a triumph. But it could not restore the temple. The destruction was irreversible. A central institution of Jewish life was gone. That is why AD 70 became a dividing line. Before the destruction, the temple dominated Jewish religious life. After it, Jewish communities had to develop without it. The transformation was painful, but it also produced new forms of religious organization that would shape later Jewish history. The story is also a reminder that empires are not simply machines of power. They are systems made of people making decisions. Vespasian needed legitimacy. Titus needed victory. Roman soldiers needed orders and supplies. Rebel leaders needed followers. Civilians needed food. Each group acted according to its own pressures. Their decisions collided in Jerusalem. Rome emerged victorious, but the empire had also spent enormous resources. Soldiers had died. The campaign had taken years. The province had been devastated. The victory was expensive even for an empire as powerful as Rome. For Titus, however, the campaign became part of his identity. When he later became emperor, his reputation as a successful commander remained important. The conquest of Jerusalem was remembered as one of the great achievements of the Flavian dynasty. For Vespasian, the victory strengthened a dynasty that had begun during the chaos of the year of the four emperors. The Flavians could present themselves as the rulers who had restored order after civil war and defeated rebellion abroad. The political message was powerful. Rome had a new imperial family, and that family had the military strength to defend the empire. Yet there is another way to understand the event. Instead of viewing the siege only from the perspective of the palace in Rome, imagine the perspective of a person inside Jerusalem who survived. The emperor was distant. The Senate was distant. The triumph was distant. What mattered was whether a relative survived, whether food could be found, and whether a home still existed. That perspective makes the event more human. Ancient history can seem like a sequence of dates and names. But behind every date were people. Behind every military unit were individuals. Behind every captured city were families. Behind every monument were memories of what had been destroyed. The Roman Empire would continue for centuries after AD 70. It would fight new wars, face new emperors, and experience new crises. The Jewish people would also continue through centuries of change. Jerusalem would remain a center of memory and religious importance. The fall of the city was not the end of either history. It was a transformation. The destruction also shows the limits of military victory. Rome could occupy Jerusalem, but it could not determine the future meaning of Jerusalem. Later generations would remember the siege in ways the Flavian emperors could not control. The same event became a symbol of Roman strength, Jewish suffering, religious transformation, and the consequences of imperial conquest. There is something haunting about the fact that the Romans themselves preserve part of the story. Their monuments, coins, and triumphal art allow modern historians to reconstruct what happened. The conquerors recorded their victory, and through those records later generations can also see the scale of the loss. The temple's destruction became one of the defining memories of the ancient Mediterranean. Its image survived in texts and traditions. The Roman relief survived in stone. Archaeological remains survived beneath later layers of the city. The people changed, the governments changed, and the empire eventually disappeared, but the event remained part of human memory. If we return to the spring of AD 70, before the final assault, the outcome was not yet visible to every person inside Jerusalem. Some still hoped. Some still fought. Some still prayed. Some still planned for a future they could not imagine would be so different. The ordinary rhythm of life had almost disappeared, but people continued to act as human beings do during crises. They protected relatives, searched for food, argued, hoped, feared, and remembered. Then the Roman army entered the city. The walls that had seemed so strong were broken. The temple burned. The rebellion ended. A chapter of Roman and Jewish history closed in fire. But history did not stop. Survivors carried the story away. Roman soldiers carried their memories back to other provinces. The Flavian emperors turned victory into monuments. Jewish communities turned loss into remembrance. Historians turned the siege into a record. Centuries later, archaeologists would continue to uncover evidence. This is why the fall of Jerusalem remains one of the most important events of the Roman age. It shows the full power of an ancient empire, but it also shows the limits of force. It demonstrates how a disciplined army can conquer a fortified city, how famine can become a weapon, and how internal division can destroy a society under pressure. At the same time, it shows that destroying a city does not necessarily destroy the identity of its people. The Romans won the war. The rebels lost. The temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was devastated. But the story continued in every generation that remembered what had happened. Today, almost 2,000 years later, the names of Titus and Vespasian are still connected with the siege. Josephus is still read. The Arch of Titus still stands. The memory of the temple remains powerful. The city of Jerusalem still exists, layered with the history of many civilizations. The Roman soldiers who marched through the city could not have known how long their victory would be remembered. They could not have imagined modern historians examining their siege works or visitors looking at the monuments created after their return. They were living through their own present, just as the people they defeated were living through theirs. That may be the deepest lesson of the siege. No one inside Jerusalem knew they were creating a story that would survive for nearly 2,000 years. They were simply experiencing events. The future gave those events meaning that the people themselves could not see. The fall of Jerusalem was not one moment alone. It was the result of years of tension, rebellion, political rivalry, military escalation, and decisions made by leaders on both sides. The final destruction was the end of a long process. The burning temple was the visible symbol of a much larger transformation. Rome emerged stronger in the short term. The Flavian dynasty gained prestige. Judea was brought under firmer imperial control, but the destruction also created memories that lasted longer than the dynasty itself. The emperors who celebrated the victory eventually disappeared. The empire itself eventually changed beyond recognition. Yet the story of Jerusalem remained. When the smoke finally cleared, the Romans had conquered the city. But they had not conquered time. They had not conquered memory. They had not conquered the future meaning of what had happened. Jerusalem had fallen, but its story had only entered another chapter. The fall of Jerusalem.